This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross, back with Anne Applebaum, author of the new book Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. It's about the famine in Ukraine that was orchestrated by Stalin in the early 1930s with the help of disinformation. Applebaum has also been examining Russian disinformation today. She's a columnist for The Washington Post and a professor at the London School of Economics. Her previous books are about Stalin's labor camps and how the Soviet Union crushed Eastern Europe after World War II. One of the things you do at the London School of Economics is that you help run a project that studies disinformation. So are you studying disinformation in elections, and what have you been looking at?
So it's a project that looks at, we have a range of things we're doing, and one of them, yes, was a project that examined Russian attempts to manipulate the German election campaign, mostly online, but not only, looking at ways in which the Russian government and agents of the Russian government or representatives of the Russian government or even just ordinary Russians were attempting to help the far right win the German election campaign. What were the techniques and tactics that they used online? What were the messages that they used? How were they trying to create divisions really within Germany, because that was the messaging that the Alternative for Germany, the German far right, was trying to use. And, you know, since we're on the topic of my book, it's really not an accident that I got interested in this issue, because so much of why the Ukrainian famine was possible, so much of why Stalin's atrocities were possible, was because of the way in which the Soviet Union used disinformation, propaganda, and what we would now call hate speech to encourage people to do terrible things. So why did people go along with totalitarianism? Why did they go along with dictatorship? They were persuaded to do so by this very divisive and bitter rhetoric. I don't want to make a direct comparison between the Soviet Union and the present. Things are very different, and it's an interesting conversation to dissect why, but they are. But nevertheless, some of the thinking of the current Russian government, of the people who run its propaganda system, has echoes of the past, and particularly this idea of divisiveness, scapegoating. You know, what's wrong with my life? You know, it can't be ever my fault. What's wrong with my society? It can't be our own decisions. We have to find a scapegoat. We have to find enemies. This is what the German far right does. It identifies Muslims and Islam and refugees and foreigners as enemies, and that gives them the
that seems to be a
need.
theme right now, doesn't it?
It is a very broad theme all across the West, and it's something that the Russians have identified as something they can use, they can push to help divide and disorganize Western democracies. And they've done it in multiple countries. You know, they did it in our country, in the United States, and they were doing it in Germany. In Germany, it was a much smaller operation. They have a wide range of interest in Germany, so it's not just in the far right. They also have some other kinds of stakes there, but it's not an accidental link. I mean, they think about, how do we make people angry? How do we make people afraid? How do we create scapegoats? You know, they understand that those are ways you can unify people to do all kinds of things if you can make them all angry at the same enemy.
What does Russia want in Germany?
Russia wants in Germany what it wants everywhere in Europe, which is it wants to end the European Union, which it sees as something that thwarts its ability to do corrupt deals and do bilateral deals in Europe. And so it supports political parties that are against the European Union. It wants to end NATO because it wants the United States and its influence out of Europe. More generally, it seeks to undermine and dislodge liberal democracy wherever it can, partly for practical reasons, because, you know, for Russian companies, it would be a lot easier to do, you know, they do business using corrupt methods, and it would be more useful to them to do business in states where rule of law isn't so respected and they can bribe people. And in other words, they're looking to export corruption rather than, and it helps to undermine democracy to do that. But I think they also seek to undermine democracy for a bigger reason, namely that democracy rhetoric, or the ideals of rule of law and freedom of speech and freedom of decision, these are ideals that are undermining for the current Russian regime. It's an oligarchic, corrupt dictatorship, and so what it fears the most is people on the streets calling for democracy. And so the extent to which it can undermine its neighbors and undermine their democracies is good for them. Then they can point to their own people and say, look, democracy is a disaster. It doesn't work in the United States. It doesn't work in Germany. And so why should you want it either?
So Angela Merkel won the election in Germany, but the far right gained seats. It did very well in the election. So do you attribute that to the Russians?
No, I don't. The Russians don't invent the far right. They can't. They don't invent political parties in foreign countries. Actually, although they have tried to a few times, that doesn't usually work. What they do is they seek to help, either sometimes with money, sometimes with advice, and sometimes with online trolling and bot campaigns and so on. They seek to help the far right in really almost every European country. They have allies. In the French election campaign, they supported Marine Le Pen. That they did with money. She was given financial aid. She's the far-right candidate in France. In Germany, they had advisors. They had an online campaign that was designed to help the far-right, using techniques that they've been working on and perfecting over a number of elections, actually going back many years. This is something they've been working on for a long time.
One of the people being investigated in America now in the investigations into the Trump campaign and Russian interference in the election is Paul Manafort, who was an advisor in Ukraine. He advised President Viktor Yanukovych and his party, and Yanukovych fled the country in 2014 after there were protests against him and his anti-democratic efforts. So you were studying Ukraine at the time that Paul Manafort was doing that advising. How soon did you find out about him, and how did you interpret his role there?
So when Paul Manafort was appointed to be Trump's campaign manager, I had this horrible feeling of my worlds clashing. So I've been working on Ukraine, which is from the American point of view, it's not a mainstream subject. It's somewhat off to the side. And so I did know about Manafort's role there. And suddenly I saw him brought into the center of U.S. politics. I suddenly realized that everything he'd done and all of the ways in which Ukrainian politics had been conducted over the last 7 years was suddenly going to be relevant to the U.S. election, as indeed it was. The kinds of campaigning that he was part of or would have known about in Ukraine, for example, the use of online trolling, the use of extensive internet disinformation campaigns. This is something I knew from Ukraine. This is what the Russians did in Ukraine and others. The creation of these big kind of violent rallies where people get beaten up. This is another Ukrainian election tactic. In a way, he brought this post-Soviet form of politics to the United States. And when I saw that happening, it was a kind of shock. As I say, it was not something I expected to see. I mean, there's a way in which perhaps we've come full circle. I mean, the United States and Western Europe exported liberal democracy and democratic politics to the East in the 1990s. And we've now had a kind of re-export. So their way of doing politics, this, as I said, violent, divisive, angry politics designed to pit people against one another and to build political coalitions based on hate campaigns. This is something that's been done in Ukraine. It's been done in other parts of the post-Soviet world. He brought it, and he and others brought it to the United States.
What was Manafort known for in terms of his campaign style in Ukraine?
Well, one of the things he was known for was his remake of Viktor Yanukovych. So Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine, who had previously been part of an attempt to buy an election. A few years earlier, he'd been part of an attempted election fraud. And so Manafort's job was to remake him, to comb his hair and buy him better suits and teach him how to speak properly and to organize his campaign and probably also to organize the publicity and the online campaign around him. And that's what he was known for. So in a way, he took a very thuggish, former criminal actually, and made him into somebody who seemed more presidential. And this is what he was best known for in Ukraine. He was also known for corruption. One of the things that happened during the U.S. election campaign that I don't think got that much attention was that a group of Ukrainian MPs and journalists went back through their records and did a little bit of investigation and found there was a kind of party ledger from the Yanukovych's party that described who they'd been paying bribes to, or who they'd been paying, off the books money to while Yanukovych was in power. And of course, one of them was Manafort, and this was publicized during the Trump election campaign while Manafort was the campaign manager.
So you felt when you were watching the Trump campaign during the period that Manafort was the campaign manager that you were seeing the exportation of Russian-style politics and disinformation being imported by Manafort into the U.S.?
Yes, I actually wrote this column in the spring of last year, saying that what Manafort is and what we're seeing with the Trump campaign is Russian-style politics in the United States.
But you're American, so you've been watching American politics from the perspective of living in Europe. So how does it look to you from where you are? Like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing around you? It's a really broad question, but I just figure you have a different perspective being an American but living in Europe right now.
Most Europeans look on the United States right now with a kind of distress that you would feel if you were stranded on a desert island and you saw off in the distance the ship that was coming to rescue you sinking. The United States for Europeans has been for many decades a kind of a source of comfort, stability, and offered for countries that don't have nuclear weapons. It offers a nuclear umbrella. But it's not just a military link. It's a ideological link, a political link, an economic link. The United States has really been the anchor of the West, the most important Western country, the biggest country, but also the one that was most convinced of its own ideals, that was most devoted to the idea of democracy and to the ideas of free speech and free commerce and free trade and all the things that have made the West rich and prosperous. And the last year has caused many to wonder how long that's going to go on being true. Not only does Trump not speak the language that American presidents have spoken for the last, certainly since the Second World War, of alliances and friendships, he also doesn't seem to speak the language of democracy. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't promote it. He doesn't seem interested in it. When he makes big speeches, he seems to tiptoe around it. They see him as somebody who chooses to be divisive rather than unifying. And people worry for the whole Western alliance, for the Western camp. How long can we continue to be cohesive? How long can we continue trading with each other as seamlessly as we've been trading? How long will we remain a power and a voice in the world if he is the first of many of a different kind of American president?
Well, Anne Applebaum, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.